This video is brought to you by Ground News. On Monday, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic magazine, Jeffrey Goldberg, reported that he'd been accidentally added to a Signal group chat that included high-level US officials, including Vice President J.D. Vance, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. In the group chat, which was titled Houthi PC Small Group, Trump's team discussed carrying out airstrikes on the Houthis in Yemen, and even apparently shared operational details of the strikes before they happened, which is what convinced Goldberg the chat was real. Now, this is obviously an appalling national security failure, but what the messages also made overwhelmingly clear is the Trump team's utter disdain for Europe. In the messages shared by Goldberg, Vance complained that he didn't want to bail Europe out again, prompting Hegseth to agree that, quote, European freeloading is pathetic, before Trump's Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller suggested somehow getting the Europeans to remunerate the US for the cost of the strikes. This shouldn't come as a total shock. Vance's disdain for Europe has been overwhelmingly apparent since at least the Munich Security Conference, and Trump himself claimed only last month that the EU was, quote, formed in order to screw the United States. Nonetheless, the Houthi group chat shows that Trump's team hate Europe both in private and in public, and the rhetoric has definitely gone up a notch recently. On Sunday, for instance, J.D. Vance affirmed America's interest in annexing Greenland and suggested that Denmark was, quote, not a good ally, while Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff called Europe dysfunctional and suggested the US could replace Europe with the Gulf monarchies in a recent interview with Tucker Carlson. So, in this video, we thought we'd try our best to figure out why Trump and his team hate Europe quite as much as they apparently do. Who's the worst politician right now? Hear our thoughts and argue with us on our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it over on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. So let's get straight into it. While there are clearly some ideological differences between the Trump administration and the EU, as we see it, the main issue is that Trump and co think the Europeans are freeloaders. In other words, Europe takes advantage of America's generosity without giving enough back in return. This complaint usually arises in the context of NATO, with Trump, and to be fair, Trump's predecessors, complaining that Europeans don't spend enough on defence because they think the US will just bail them out. However, this isn't the only sense in which this Trump administration thinks that Europe is freeloading. In the Houthi group chat, for instance, J.D. Vance argued that Europe was freeloading on the US Navy and the role it plays as the guarantor of global maritime trade, noting that only 3% of US trade runs through the Suez, compared to 40% of European trade. Trump himself also sees the US-EU trade deficit as proof that the EU is freeloading on the US economy, relying on the buying power of the American consumer to drive demand for European goods without buying American goods in return. At first glance, at least some of these complaints seem reasonable. For instance, it's true that, both in absolute terms and relative to GDP, the US spends more on defence than the vast majority of NATO members, and has done for the past few decades. It's also true that the US Navy plays a key role in guaranteeing commercial maritime traffic, despite the fact that this doesn't have a massive direct economic benefit for the US. This is essentially because, thanks to the size of its internal market, the US relies less on external trade than most other countries, which means security of maritime traffic is more important for countries in Europe and the Middle East than it is for America. But we think there's one big caveat worth mentioning here, and that is that fundamentally America doesn't do these things for Europe or anyone else. It does them for self-interested reasons. Take America's massive military spending, for instance. American politicians don't vote to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on defence because they're worried about Europe. Rather, they do this primarily because there's a powerful domestic constituency in favour of military spending, and because, for a whole load of reasons, America's political class wants to have the world's strongest military. This has been made clear by the rise of China. American policymakers reliably justify increases in American spending by saying that the US needs to stay ahead of China. This has nothing to do with protecting Europe, and everything to do with preserving American hegemony. Similarly, while it's true that Europe benefits from the role that the US Navy plays in guaranteeing global maritime trade, especially in and around the Persian Gulf, the US isn't doing this to be nice. Rather, it's because it gives the US immense leverage and allows the US to put more pressure on Iran. This speaks to a wider disagreement between Europe and the US on Iran, with the US generally taking a more hawkish stance, in part due to their close relations with Israel and Saudi Arabia, and the Europeans generally being keener on rapprochement, in part because Europe wants to buy Iranian oil and gas. As well as putting more pressure on Iran, the US also maintains a naval presence in the Middle East, because the only navy that could replace them would be China. And if there's one thing the US likes less than controlling the world's shipping lanes, it's having China do it instead. Anyway, this is probably why, despite occasionally complaining about it on Twitter, Trump actually stepped up America's military presence in the Gulf in his first term. Something similar is true of the trade deficit, by the way. Leaving aside the fact that very few economists see a trade deficit as a form of freeloading, after all, what's wrong with American consumers buying German cars, arguably the root cause of America's trade deficit is the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. This creates extra demand for dollars and dollar-denominated assets like US treasuries, allowing the US government to borrow trillions of dollars and making the dollar more valuable than it would otherwise be, which means more imports and less exports. But again, the dollar's reserve status is something that most American politicians, including Trump, want to preserve. Trump has gone as far as threatening BRICS countries that try to de-dollarize with massive tariffs. In other words, even if you think that Europe's economy is in some sense freeloading on American demand, this is a consequence of a deliberate policy posture pursued by successive American administrations. So you get the idea. The main reason that Trump and co hate Europe is because they think that Europe is a freeloader. But this isn't because the US has always been too generous to Europe. Rather, the US was following its own strategic self-interest, and this incidentally created opportunities for freeloading that European countries exploited. This doesn't necessarily excuse Europe. After all, you might argue that, as an ally, Europe should have done more to help the US in these cases. But it's not a straightforward case of America being a benevolent hegemon, and Europeans being lazy freeloaders, which is the narrative that's sometimes presented. This story about Trump striking Yemen has been covered by more than 61 sources. Interestingly, we know that 11 of these have been reported by the left, and 12 have been reported by the right. That's because this week's sponsor, Ground News, are experts on pulling back the curtain on media bias. Built by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news, they ingest over 50,000 articles from all over the world and then organise each by story. For each and every story, you can see the number of reporting sources, where these sources lead on the political spectrum at an individual level and group level, compare the headlines of each source, and read each article all without ever leaving the app. But one of the best parts of the app is their comparison feature, which highlights specific differences in left-leaning and right-leaning reporting. For example, for this story, left-leaning outlets tended to focus on the humanitarian consequences of the strike, while right-leaning outlets tended to focus on the strategic thinking behind them. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. If you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan using the link in the description or by scanning the QR code. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.